Hello viewers, it's Joe here, also known as Rufio. Now before we get started, I want to address the elephant in the room. If you're someone who has seen my content before, you'll know that I'm mostly known for Yu-Gi-Oh content. But today I wanted to bring you something a little bit different. Now at the time of recording this video, I'm still not sure whether this is something that I want to do on a separate channel or on my main Rufio channel that you might know if you're a Yu-Gi-Oh player. And if you're not a Yu-Gi-Oh player and you're someone who is more interested in Warhammer, well, welcome aboard, I guess. Now for today's video, I wanted to just talk a little bit about why I'm buying my first major box of models in probably 18 years. But before we get into my box of choice, I wanted to talk a little bit about what my history is like with the Warhammer game. So how did I get started with Warhammer? Well, actually, this is kind of a bit of a throwback. I think like many people, I got into the whole idea of Warhammer quite young. It's not something that any of my friends played at the beginning or anything like that, but my first kind of dabble into this was going to Milton Keynes to the city centre, and there was a bunch of people playing a variety of different war games, Warhammer included in one of the massive halls there. I remember my dad taking me along to look at some of the models, and I didn't know that this was going to be a little bit of a catalyst for what came later on. So we fast forward a few years, and I've got some friends who've got one or two of these models, but I don't really know or understand what they really are. I got donated a couple, I think maybe an Eldar model, Bretonian soldier of some sort, I don't really know. It may even have been Empire, this was a very, very long time ago. Now I wasn't big into Warhammer or even that interested in the game at the time. One of my friends donated me, I think one of the old rulebooks or something like that. Although that was swiftly stolen by a kid who lived around the corner. And I very much didn't touch them again for some time after this. Now, probably fast forward yet another year later, and I'm sat at school in the library, and one of my friends has some models. Now, I'm kind of familiar with Warhammer at this point, but not really interested in it in any kind of meaningful way. I went over to go look at some of his models. He had some Tyranids, and I thought they were really, really cool. I'd grown up watching the Alien franchise, courtesy of my dad, so I could kind of recognise some of the inspiration there, shall we say. And before you know it, I wanted to get some of my own models. So being a child of that age, I was probably maybe 13 or 14 at that time. I didn't really have a lot of money to spend on models. Now, I could afford a Chaos bike, which I went out and bought. I think there were single ones for £5 back at that time. So I bought one of those, I built it, and then that was it. I was kind of bitten a little bit by the bug. Shortly afterwards, I managed to save enough money to buy some of my own models, and I started off with Chaos Space Marines. I went out and bought my Codex. I went out and bought a big box which had a Defiler in, which was very, very cool at the time. Some Berserkers, which now are absolutely my favourite models. And I got to building and painting. Now, sadly, this part of my story does end a little bit in tears. I decided, partly through building my army, that I decided I didn't really want it to look like Black Legion anymore, typical Chaos Space Marines. I wanted to have a Khorne army. So I nipped over to one of my local hobby stores, not Games Workshop I might add. I let them know that I wanted to paint some models and asked if they had some paints available that I could use for my models. I was handed a can of red spray and some little pots of paint. I got home, hurried, excited, and I started spraying my models. Unfortunately, this is where it all starts to go a little bit wrong. The spray I'd been sold was, unfortunately, some red gloss. And the paints I'd been sold were enamel paints. These two did not go very well over the top of the models that I had already started. Now, fortunately, at this time, I had only really sprayed the Berserkers, although they were, to put it politely, fucking ruined. I hoped I could maybe save some of the details by putting some chestnut ink over the top, and they just ended up looking muddy. But this was all I had, so I left the remaining models in black, accepted that my Khorne Berserkers looked like a pile of shit, but I was happy I could at least play with some models. So I dabbled in a few games with friends at school. We even ran a small Warhammer club after school in one of the DT rooms, as we call them here in the UK. They gave us a cupboard to lock our things in. We had some friends who played what is now the Middle-earth strategy game, I believe. It was Lord of the Rings back at the time. We had friends who had some fantasy models, but of course the majority of people had their 40k. Now this was all I would really buy model-wise for a little bit of time. But again, fast forwarding a couple of years later, and we saw Black Templars get their own codex. And I knew at that stage that I wanted to invest in a new army. I was unhappy with how things had gone previously. I wanted to make a real good go of this again. So I dumped an absolute bucket load of money into Black Templars. I picked up their brand new codex. I went out and bought a ton of models. Some of them I still love to this day. Unfortunately, I don't own any of them anymore, but that's a story for another time. But I really did invest in it. I got to the point where I was really enjoying the game, I was enjoying the lore, and I was enjoying the painting. And I actually decided to apply for a job at Games Workshop at that time. So I continued over the course of probably about 2 years at this point, touching up details on models here and there, buying a few more to build up on my army, that kind of thing, you know, as you do. And before you knew it, I was 18 years old, and I was considering applying for a job at Games Workshop, and in fact, that is exactly what I did. Now, this was around the time of 5th edition, I believe. I think the rulebooks had just came out when I made the application, and I was invited in to interview. I was invited in to interview at the Milton Keynes store. The manager, who is there now, I believe, may have actually been the manager at the time. I definitely did my interview with him. I don't know if he was running the store back then. Fortunately, he doesn't remember who I am. I was whittled away to a small stock room upstairs, told to recite some ideas of battles between an orc and a space marine in excruciating detail. That's exactly what I did, and he seemed relatively impressed. I spent the day on the floor, and the feedback, however, was a little bit less good from that point. But I digress. I was then sent off to Oxford for part 2 of my interview a few days later. Unfortunately, the store hadn't been told that the interviews were going to take place, so I was offered the chance to wait a few hours to be interviewed, while someone who had travelled with me for the same thing instead threw a hissy fit and left the store. I waited downstairs, waited patiently for my interview, and the interview seemed to go very, very well. I received a call back, probably within a couple of weeks of this, from Games Workshop, from the manager himself, and I understand that this was to offer me the position. Now, as fate would have it, being an 18-year-old and working at McDonald's at the time, I was instead offered management there, which was probably a little bit better paid than what Games Workshop was doing, which says a lot. And as I tried to call back the Games Workshop store and the manager was on holiday, I decided to take the promotion rather than the job at Games Workshop. And that was pretty much it for Warhammer for me for quite some time. That, of course, was in 2009. But in 2021, something different happened altogether. I spotted there was some magazines which had some cheap models with it, and I hadn't painted in a long time, and nor I consider even picking up any Warhammer models at all. But when I saw these Hatchet magazines that were kicking around with a Space Marine and an Necron on, I decided I had to pick some up. They were just too cheap not to, and I could buy a few paints. It wouldn't be a big investment, but it'd be enough to give me something a little bit to do. I believe this was also around the time the Warhammer Plus subscription launched, so I thought, here's a good excuse to get an extra few models with my £10 off voucher, and I'll just enjoy some of the lore content as I'd slowly been getting back into it on YouTube at that time. Now, I wasn't really deep into things at this point. I was still very heavily doing my Yu-Gi-Oh! Content. At this point, I was still doing 3 videos a week. I was travelling to events multiple times in a month, so I didn't really have time for another major hobby, so this was just a cool way to relax at the end of the day. But this only lasted a short period of time, and I stopped again altogether, just sticking to watching lore videos, and that was pretty much it. However, a few months ago, at the time of recording this video, I spotted there was more of these Hatchet magazines had come out with some Age of Sigmar models, and I just really wanted an excuse to paint. My daughter's not long been born, so I wanted a hobby that I could do in the lounge, and still be on hand to help if I needed to be there. Now, I really don't want to divulge how many of these bloody magazines I picked up, but there's a fucking lot of Age of Sigmar models that I never intend to play with that are in a box in my lounge, but I guess they'll be good painting practice. However, it's fair to say that I have been bitten again by the bug. And that leads us, of course, much closer to today. Now, I tried painting a bunch of different models. I painted those Space Marines, some slightly better than others, and some so terrible that I couldn't even bear to finish them. I've also decided to dabble in some different things. I thought I'd take the challenge doing my Parasite and Mortrex, but the coconut crab idea didn't work out very well when you're as amateur as I am. This will certainly not be a display piece model anytime soon. I do think, though, that I've made some improvements. I recently got myself a nice Dark Angels Intercessor and painted that up, and I think it's a much better job than I've done with anything recently. I decided a few weeks back, however, to commit to picking a specific army to work with. I had this weird logic in my head coming back that if I just painted models I liked, I would never spend as much money. Unfortunately, it turns out there are more models I like across different armies and different games than there are just buying into one specific one. So a few weeks ago, I decided to make the decision to go with Chaos Space Marines. Now, I'd been toying with the idea of the World Eaters, however, I'm an impatient man, and the reality is that I just wanted to paint some Berserkers, and when I found out I could still take Berserkers in my main Chaos army, it was a no-brainer. I'd also heard about these Hounds of Abaddon that I really liked the idea of, these black berserkers, probably with just a one red shoulder pad, but I've seen a few variations of that, and they sounded really cool, and I, decided I wanted to do those for myself. Now, I was fortunate enough to roll into my own Games Workshop a couple of weeks ago and find that they had one single remaining boarding patrol for Chaos Space Marines. The manager was nice enough to put it to one side at our lovely Games Workshop in Milton Keynes, and it is still a Games Workshop at the time of recording, although I believe it's going through a rebrand in a couple of weeks to become a Warhammer store. But it is still very much the retro outfit that some of you may have seen before. Sticky carpets and all. But at this point I knew that I'd been bitten by the bug, and I knew that I'd have to act fast because he could reserve it for a week for me. So I decided to sell some of my old spare cards that I had kicking around, and make the decision that any money I got from that I was then going to pump into getting some additional models for my army. Now, I'd picked up my boarding patrol, thinking that this would be all I would afford. And of course things went from bad to worse. I then spent money on the combat patrol to boost my ranks a little bit and give myself some extra models. And of course, like everyone else at this point, I accepted my addiction, went out and bought a Venom Crawler and Obliterators, no, not a Bloodthirster, although the box is really cool, and I then also bought the Mauler and Forge Fiend kit, and a Master of Executions. But it didn't stop there. I am fully addicted like everyone else, and I've accepted this is now my life. Buying the Black Templars Codex and the original Chaos Space Marine Codex I had wasn't enough for me anymore. I decided to buy into some more. The Eye of Terror one that I'd never been able to touch. I knew exactly what it was, but it wasn't there at the time. I bought some of the slightly newer and some of the older codexes. In fact, I managed to pick up the second edition one the other day quite cheap as well. As you can tell, I'm now fully balls deep into this game. And that leads us where we are today. I now have a significant number of Chaos Space Marine models to build and assemble and paint, although this will take me quite some time. I'm even considering taking up the challenge of magnetising my Fiend kit so that I can play with either a Mauler or a Forge Fiend, depending on what I choose. Now, like many people, I have some innocent intentions here of just playing a few games with my friends, although I know quickly how these things change because that's what was going to happen to Yu-Gi-Oh! And that was almost 5,000 subs ago. So I'm not oblivious to how quickly this may continue to evolve into a bit of an obsession. So, where do we go from here? Well, the reality is I don't really know. What I do know, though, is that I'll probably be sticking around doing some extra Warhammer content alongside the Yu-Gi-Oh! But that, viewers, is all from me today. Thank you very much for coming along. Hopefully, by virtue of the fact that you made it this far into the video, you've enjoyed it enough to hit subscribe, or at least hated it enough that you couldn't possibly look away. And if you really enjoyed it, you might have hit the notification bell along the way. Now, you might be wondering what's next for the channel, what's next in this journey of mine. The truth is, I don't really know at this stage. I imagine I will, however, be putting out more Warhammer content. That's certainly the plan, at least. What it's going to look like at this stage, I'm not really sure. I'm definitely not a good enough painter to be doing any painting tutorials anytime soon, as you've well seen in this video. But I'm certainly considering doing stuff maybe about the lore and maybe even about the journey that I take in terms of my painting and such. But I guess really what I'm trying to say is stick around to find out. But anyway, it's enough waffling on from me. Thank you very much for coming along. I do appreciate you being here, and I will see you in the next one.